Episode 15, Crisis and Power, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. So I just wrapped up the JV conference meet for cross country, and honestly, I'm pretty happy with how the season went. I improved a lot, but I'm also kind of ready to take a break. And I guess that feeling, like pushing through something tough and then needing to reset, kind of made me think about what we're talking about today. Because this period is called an age of crisis, right? So what exactly was going wrong in Europe at this time?
That's a useful way to think about it, Miles. Historians use the phrase age of crisis because multiple systems, economic, political, and social, were all under stress at the same time. You have population losses, economic contraction, warfare, and religious conflict all overlapping.
And what makes it feel like a crisis to people living through it is the instability of everyday life. Prices rise, food becomes scarce, violence increases, and long-standing assumptions about how society works start to feel uncertain.
So this isn't just one disaster. It's more like everything is becoming unstable at once?
Exactly. And when multiple systems begin to fail at the same time, it exposes the limits of how society is organized.
So what did society look like before things started breaking down?
Most Europeans lived in small rural villages. These villages were tightly organized communities centered on a church and a manor. Daily life revolved around agriculture, seasonal rhythms, and local relationships.
And those relationships were structured hierarchically. At the top of village society were relatively prosperous peasants who owned enough land to feed themselves. They often acted as local leaders, renting out tools or livestock and coordinating work.
Below them were small landowners and tenant farmers. They might own some land, but not enough to sustain themselves fully, so they had to sell produce or labor to survive.
And at the bottom were landless laborers, people who depended entirely on wages or service to others.
So most people are tied to land and local relationships, not really connected to a national government.
That's right. Authority is highly decentralized. Power is exercised locally by landlords and regional elites rather than by a strong central state.
And it's important to note that this varies by region. In Western Europe, some peasants have more independence, but in Central and Eastern Europe, most peasants are serfs, legally bound to the land and under the authority of nobles.
So this is still very much a feudal-style system.
Yes, local, land-based, and decentralized.
So what starts to break this system?
A combination of environmental and economic pressures. Agricultural productivity declines, partly due to ongoing Little Ice Age, which reduces food supply.
At the same time, populations are under pressure and food prices rise sharply. For people already living close to subsistence, even small increases can be devastating.
And governments are also raising taxes, right?
Yes, states need more revenue, especially to fund warfare. That increases the burden on peasants and urban workers.
And those pressures lead to unrest. You see food riots, tax revolts, and other forms of resistance happening frequently across Europe.
So people are basically pushing back because they can't survive under these conditions.
Yes, but it's not just desperation. Many historians describe this as a moral economy. People believed there was a fair way markets should operate, especially for essential goods like grain.
So they thought prices should be controlled somehow?
In a sense, yes. When merchants hoarded grain or raised prices too high, people saw that as unjust. So during riots, they often tried to restore what they believed was a fair price, rather than simply loot.
And that tells us these uprisings weren't attempts to overthrow the system. They were attempts to correct it.
Another important detail is the role of women. Because women were often responsible for feeding their families, they were frequently at the center of these protests, organizing crowds and confronting merchants.
So they're actually leading a lot of these actions.
In many cases, yes. And that shows how directly the crisis was felt at the household level.
And from a systems perspective, widespread unrest signals that existing structures are no longer functioning effectively.
And then on top of that, you've got major wars happening.
Yes, the 30 Years' War is the most important example. It begins in the Holy Roman Empire as a conflict between Catholic and Protestant states, especially after tensions rise over the rights of Protestants within the empire.
So at first it's really about religion inside the empire?
Exactly. But it doesn't stay that way. Very quickly, it becomes a broader political conflict. Other European powers get involved, not just because of religion, but because of concerns about balance of power.
That's where things shift. Religion is still important, but politics starts to drive decisions.
A key example is Cardinal Richelieu. He is a Catholic cardinal serving the French monarchy, but he supports Protestant forces in the war.
Wait, so a Catholic leader is backing Protestants?
Yes, because France is trying to weaken the Habsburgs, who control both Spain and large parts of the Holy Roman Empire. From a political standpoint, supporting Protestant states helps limit Habsburg power.
So the war becomes less about defending religious belief and more about power and influence in Europe.
So it turns into an international conflict.
Exactly. Multiple states join in, and the war expands far beyond its original scope.
And the consequences are devastating, especially in Central Europe. Some regions of the Holy Roman Empire lose up to 1/3 of their population.
That's huge.
It is. Villages are abandoned, farmland goes uncultivated, and famine becomes more common.
Armies move across the countryside, living off the land. They seize food, destroy crops, and spread disease. Trade networks break down, and local economies collapse.
So it's not just soldiers fighting, it's affecting everyone.
Absolutely. Civilians suffer enormously. Violence, displacement, and economic disruption become part of everyday life in war-torn regions.
And the long-term consequences are just as important. The war weakens the Holy Roman Empire politically, reinforces the independence of its member states, and demonstrates how destructive large-scale conflict can be in a fragmented political system.
It also contributes to the broader sense of crisis. People are not just dealing with economic hardship, they're living through war, loss, and instability on a massive scale.
And that scale of destruction pushes rulers to rethink how power should be organized. It becomes clear that stronger, more centralized states are better able to survive and compete in this environment.
So how do governments respond to all of this instability?
They begin to centralize power. One of the most important developments is the creation of standing armies, permanent professional military forces loyal to the state rather than to individual nobles.
That's a major shift from earlier periods, when nobles raised troops only when needed.
Exactly. Now rulers recruit soldiers directly, train them systematically, and maintain them year-round. Armies grow dramatically, from around 125,000 in earlier conflicts to several hundred thousand by the end of the century in places like France.
That sounds expensive.
It is, and supporting these armies requires new systems, more consistent taxation, more efficient administration, and larger bureaucracies.
So the crisis forces governments to become more organized.
Yes, but it's not just the crisis. There are longer-term developments that make this possible. Expanding trade networks increase access to wealth that can be taxed. Rising literacy, connected to earlier humanist education and the spread of print, means more people can serve in administrative roles.
So you've got more money and more people who can run the government.
Exactly. And there's also a shift in the relationship between monarchs and the church. After the conflicts of the Reformation, monarchs have more independence from religious authority, which allows them to consolidate power.
So what you're seeing is a transition. The older, decentralized feudal system is giving way to something new, more centralized, more bureaucratic, and more controlled by the state.
So the crisis doesn't just destroy the old system, it pushes Europe toward a new one.
Precisely.
So where does art fit into all of this? It seems pretty random that in the middle of a chapter about politics all of a sudden, there is a section about art.
The Baroque style reflects the emotional intensity of the period. It's dramatic, full of movement, and designed to create strong emotional responses.
And it serves a purpose. The Catholic Church uses Baroque art to reinforce religious devotion during a time of conflict. The goal is to inspire awe and reaffirm faith.
Monarchs use it as well. Large-scale architecture, elaborate ceremonies, and artistic patronage all help project power and legitimacy.
So it's kind of like visual propaganda?
That's one way to think about it. It shapes how people experience authority, whether religious or political.
So how does France respond to all of this?
France becomes one of the strongest examples of successful state building. It begins with Henry IV, who comes to power after a period of intense religious conflict.
He issues the Edict of Nantes, which allows Protestants limited religious freedom and helps reduce tensions.
He also focuses on rebuilding the economy, repairing infrastructure like roads and canals, and stabilizing taxation. These measures help restore order and strengthen the monarchy.
So he's stabilizing things after the crisis.
Exactly. But the real shift towards centralization happens under Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu is not the king. He's the chief minister to Louis XIII, which means he effectively runs the day-to-day operations of the French government.
And that position gives him enormous influence. Even though he's a cardinal in the Catholic Church, his primary role is political. He's advising the king, directing policy, and making decisions about how to strengthen the state.
He rises to power because the monarchy needs capable administrators. France is coming out of a period of instability, and the king relies on trusted officials like Richelieu to carry out reforms and enforce royal authority across the kingdom.
And Richelieu is determined to reduce the power of the nobility.
One of his most important policies is the Edict of 1626, which orders nobles to dismantle fortified castles. Without those fortifications, it becomes much harder for them to organize resistance against the king.
So he's basically taking away their ability to rebel.
Yes, and more broadly, he strengthens royal authority by limiting independent centers of power and expanding the reach of the state. He also develops the intendant system, royal officials sent into the provinces to collect taxes, oversee justice, and enforce the king's policies. Because intendants are appointed by the crown and not tied to local noble families, they help bypass traditional feudal power structures and extend centralized authority across France.
So Richelieu is basically weakening the nobles and building up a system where the king can actually enforce his authority across the whole country, not just rely on local elites.
Exactly. So by the time Louis XIV comes to power, the groundwork for centralization has already been laid.
And Louis XIV takes that to the next level?
He does, but it's important to understand how he gets there. Louis becomes king as a child, so during his early reign, power is exercised by his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin.
And during that time, France experiences a series of revolts known as the Fronde. These uprisings involve nobles, regional authorities, and even members of the Paris Parlement pushing back against royal authority.
So even after Richelieu, the nobles are still trying to resist the king?
Exactly. The Fronde shows that centralization is not complete. There is still significant resistance to royal power.
And for Louis, this is a formative experience. He witnesses instability, rebellion, and the dangers of a weak monarchy.
So that shapes how he rules later on?
Very much so. When Mazarin dies and Louis takes direct control of the government, he is determined to prevent that kind of instability from happening again. He is often seen as the model of an absolute monarch. He claims that his authority comes directly from God and that he alone has the right to make and enforce laws.
But it's important to remember that absolutism isn't total control. It depends on managing relationships with elites, especially the nobility.
Exactly. Louis builds a system that concentrates power in the monarchy while ensuring that elites depend on him for status and advancement.
And that's where Versailles comes in.
Yes. When students visit Versailles, one of the most striking things is how the palace itself reflects the structure of power. It's designed to place the king at the center of everything.
Nobles are required to spend time at court, where they compete for the king's favor, rather than building independent power in the provinces.
So instead of rebelling, they're trying to stay close to him.
Exactly. It's a system of control through dependence. Patronage, granting offices, honors, and favors, becomes the mechanism through which the king maintains loyalty.
And the cultural influence of Versailles spreads across Europe. French becomes the language of diplomacy, and other courts imitate French styles and customs.
But he's also constantly at war.
Yes, France is engaged in warfare for a large portion of his reign. These wars are aimed at expanding territory, securing borders, and increasing prestige.
And they reinforce the need for a strong, centralized state. Large armies require consistent funding, organization, and leadership.
The military becomes a key instrument of state power, and other European states begin to adopt similar models.
And the economy is tied into this too.
Yes, under mercantilism, the state actively directs economic activity to increase wealth and strengthen national power.
The idea is that economic strength supports military and political strength. Trade, production, and regulation are all organized to benefit the state.
So everything, government, military, economy, is becoming more centralized and connected.
Exactly. That's the key transformation of this period.
So why doesn't Spain follow the same path?
Spain faces significant challenges. Its economy becomes heavily dependent on silver from the Americas, and when that revenue declines, the underlying weaknesses become clear.
There's also less effective leadership, which makes it difficult to adapt to changing conditions.
So they don't build the same kind of centralized system?
Not as effectively. Spain struggles to modernize its economy and maintain strong political control.
So while France becomes a model of centralization, Spain becomes an example of what happens when those changes don't take hold.
So if we zoom out, the 17th century is an age of crisis because everything is under pressure. But it's also a turning point because new systems are being built.
Exactly. Crisis and creativity go together in this period.
And the systems that emerge, centralized states with strong armies, bureaucracies, and economies, will shape European history for centuries.
Next episode, we'll look at the rise of absolutism in Central and Eastern Europe and explore the distinctive features of Russian and Ottoman rule. Thanks for listening to the Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions.